Each week on the Viewpoints Radio podcast, you'll hear from our leading experts on an important topic within education, history, society, psychology, and more.
When you have lawmakers that create systematic policies that are really only set up to favor people with deep pockets, then you have the rise of corporate industry taking over.
Viewpoints Radio podcast is produced by our team of award-winning journalists. Subscribe today by searching Viewpoints Radio wherever you listen to podcasts.
With the first presidential debate already out of the way, political rallies, conventions, and advertising are only ramping up. Billions of dollars are funneled into television, radio, and digital media ads. But what's the payoff? Are these commercials influencing anyone, or are they just another nuisance to ignore for a few seconds before your show comes back on? Donald Green, professor of political science at Columbia University, says that instead of swaying potential voters over to their candidate, a lot of advertising is aimed at the current fan base.
The main goal is to create an enduring surge in support for a given candidate, sometimes for an issue or a cause if you're talking about a ballot measure, sometimes for a political party if you're talking about a country that has party-oriented elections. But it's doing something that lasts long enough so that the person can vote with that idea in mind.
Green says advertising has changed over time, partly because many are funded by PACs and super PACs. Since presidential candidates can receive public funding, the Federal Election Commission has regulations in place for how much each campaign is allowed to spend. However, PACs and super PACs have no limit on the amount of money they're allowed to spend on communication advertisements in federal elections.
So they can say whatever they want. And so in that sense, I think they're more edgy than they used to be. But at the same time, the basic formula is there. One formula is kind of dark, negative advertising about the opponent and his or her depredations. Another one is a kind of hagiography and celebration of the preferred candidate. Another one is more of an information-oriented contrast ad that says, the forces of light support this, the forces of evil support that, and trying to draw the distinction between the two candidates.
The strategy can also depend on who the candidates are. If a sitting president is running against an unknown challenger, the advertisers won't even mention the opponent, so as to not increase name recognition with the audience. But with two or more well-known candidates, advertisers choose a different strategy that often highlights the candidate's values and past actions, or lack thereof. Dr. Richard Petty notes that possibly the biggest shift in strategy of the last decade is the rise of negative advertising.
The reason for that is negative advertising is generally very effective. But some of the research we've done has shown that it's more effective for certain kinds of people than other kinds of people. And so I'm not sure the people doing the campaigning know that, but they know overall it's more effective. And the reason it's more effective is who is more influenced by negative than positive advertising,
which various research, including Petty's, has answered. He's a professor of psychology at The Ohio State University and was able to reveal a pattern where many people today are voting against someone rather than for a candidate. Interestingly, another rising trend is that more Americans are identifying as independents. The Pew Research Center shows that identification of registered voters is split nearly evenly, with 49% leaning Democrat and 48% leaning Republican. However, when they dug into these numbers, they noticed that 35% of these voters say they are independent. And even if they may lean more to one party, Petty says that the voting practices are different than those who fully identify as Republican or Democrat.
Partisans think of themselves, Republicans and Democrats, in terms of who they are. I am a Democrat. I am a Republican. And so that is associated with voting for the Democrat, or I'm voting for the Republican. And so the partisans, the people who say I'm a Republican or Democrat, tend to be those people who are voting for someone. If you're an independent, basically you have what we call in social psychology a negational identity. You think in terms of politics, in terms of what I am not. I'm not a Democrat. I'm not a Republican.
Meaning that independent voters have a mindset of voting to make sure a certain candidate loses rather than who they want in office. Petty was able to confirm this trend by surveying partisan and independent voters. And when they analyzed research from elections over the last 12 years, they realized this ideology has stuck true.
So it turns out this pattern holds in all of those presidential election years, that in certain surveys, they ask people, are you a Republican or Democrat or independent? And then are you voting for somebody? Or are you voting against somebody? And in every single one of those election years, it's the independents who are most likely to say they're voting against somebody. So it's a pretty robust phenomenon.
Since independent voters are such a big chunk of the voter population, and they vote based on who they don't want to win, it makes sense that we're seeing more and more negative advertising.
Independents often will determine, right, which way the election goes. So if you can get a person who's kind of independent, maybe on the fence, to believe that Biden is very terrible or Trump is very terrible, then they're going to vote for the one who's less terrible.
But what about the other voters who clearly identify with one party? Well, Petty says they don't really need much convincing at all, since they've already aligned themselves with their candidate. So instead of trying to sway voters, the strategy becomes to motivate them to get out and vote. It may not be surprising that these ideologies are consistent in other areas of life as well.
It even goes into the consumer domain. Some people are very pro Apple products, and they have to have a Mac, and they hate PCs, and others are the opposite. And one or the other motivation can drive you to purchase. It could be, I'm very pro Apple, and that's why I want to get a Mac. And other people are, I just hate the PCs, and that's why I'm getting it. Not that I love those products as I hate. So it's a very fundamental distinction about our identity. Do I want my side to win, or do I want the other side to lose? And what kinds of advertising, whether it's political advertising or consumer advertising, appeals to you depends on what your orientation is.
And now that we know which types of advertisements influence different ideologies, the question becomes whether they actually make a dent in how people will vote. Green says that they're not really effective, especially when looking at television commercials.
I think that the effects tend to be small. Every time they're measured, they're small. I can't think of a single instance where a study was done rigorously and found big effects. Moreover, to the extent that you do find big effects, they tend to subside within a matter of a few days.
But even with research showing the truth, Green says many campaigns continue to blindly spend money on these traditional strategies.
Advertisers spend unbelievably large sums of money every single day. It's unfathomable how much they spend. And even more mind-boggling is how little research they do to justify what they spend.
Ad Impact, a firm that tracks political ad spending, estimates that nearly $2.7 billion will be spent on advertising for this year's presidential election. Add in the Senate, House, and state elections, and the firm projects that spending will surpass $10 billion by the end of the 2024 election cycle. And while campaigns may not have much evidence to back up these record-setting numbers, Green says that's not necessarily by choice. Even when he's been hired by political campaigns to conduct studies, outside influences have hindered Green's research.
Many times I've been kind of elbowed out of evaluations or sabotaged by campaign consultants who realize that the last thing they need in life is to have an academic doing a rigorous evaluation of their work, because the profit margin is absolutely enormous. They have the goose that laid the golden egg, and we could be the goose killer, basically, is the problem. They have an enormously profitable operation, and the people who will tell the candidate that their ads are working, well, it's the campaign consultants themselves. And so they don't want to have an outsider say, oh, not so fast. I don't see, much lift here. Or if there's lift, I only see it for a day or two.
But money isn't the only reason to keep these ads alive. Green says that while they may not be super effective on voters, television advertisements help show potential donors that this is a serious and successful campaign to get behind.
It's not for no reason, for example, that a lot of campaign commercials are produced that are almost never aired, in part because they're just there to impress donors and to get free media as kind of, outrageous or current events, whatever they are, things that will attract news attention. But in terms of what an advertiser is trying to do, I think the advertiser thinks that the ads will boost their poll numbers in ways that will make them more credible, and that will in turn attract more donor support, which will pay for more ads, which will then continue to fund the upward cycle.
Though that may be the plan, Green doesn't believe it works quite that smoothly. And it's not the commercial's fault. Oftentimes, the lack of effectiveness is due to the type of outlet campaigns choose. Viewership on streaming platforms surpassed cable for the first time in 2022. But eMarketer, a research company, says that the bulk of spending continues to be channeled into cable marketing. Instead, Petty thinks the rising strategy of using non-conventional avenues, such as social media, will have a larger impact.
They may be by influencers or people you don't know are sort of being incentivized to support a candidate or a particular point of view, or they may be getting their news from a podcast and they're seeing an interview or hearing an interview with someone who's pro or anti a candidate. And so those people who are representing candidates who are being interviewed on podcasts are not traditional advertising, but they can still adopt the frame of telling you what's great about a particular person or why not electing someone is the most important thing to save the world.
Focusing on social media exposes the ads to more people, but it also gives campaigns the opportunity to hit specific demographics.
Many of these more sort of social media focused ads, digitally focused ads, they're targeting specific people or specific demographic profiles. And so the messages tend to be tailored for that group, as opposed to broadcast television, which is kind of catch-all thing.
And even with all the access that the internet and social media allow, Green still believes that the most effective strategy is the old-fashioned boots-on-the-ground approach, where supporters host local events and go door-to-door to build support. Despite these evidence-based thoughts, we probably won't see a shift away from television and social media ad spending anytime soon. You can find more information about Donald Green, Dr. Richard Petty, and all of our guests on our website, radiohealthjournal.org. For more behind the scenes, follow Radio Health Journal on Facebook, Instagram, and X. Our writer-producer is Kristen Farah. Our executive producer is Amira Zaveri. I'm Elizabeth Westfield.
Each week on the Viewpoints Radio podcast, you'll hear from our leading experts on an important topic within education, history, society, psychology, and more.
Building AI systems is like having kids. You want your kids to be smarter than you are. You want your kids to be more successful than you are. And at the end of the day, you want your kids not to kill you.
Viewpoints Radio podcast is produced by our team of award-winning journalists. Subscribe today by searching Viewpoints Radio wherever you listen to podcasts.